The cold Pacific water pressed in from all sides, but James barely felt it. His hands shook around the dive knife, every nerve alive with fear and adrenaline. Just feet away, a humpback whale floated motionless, its enormous eye fixed squarely on him. The creature's breaths came ragged, a mountain of muscle and bone straining against a web of ropes. Dozens of crab traps, 3,000 pounds of dead weight, dragged it down like an anchor to the grave. James slipped the blade under one of the ropes and pulled hard. The cord snapped, and instantly the whale convulsed. A sudden surge of power rippled through the water, nearly throwing James backward. Shouts rang out from the boat, warnings, panicked cries, but he forced himself to stay put. For one terrifying second, James thought he had made things worse. What if the whale panicked, dragged him under, or bolted before the rest of the traps were cut free? Worse still, the scent of blood and oil hung heavy in the current, an open invitation for sharks. He took a breath, steadying his grip. There was no turning back now. The whale hadn't left. It hovered, unblinking, watching him. But why? What would it do when it was finally free? The story of that day didn't begin with James and his knife. It began the night before, when the ocean grew restless just beyond the Golden Gate. Fishermen returning late from their rounds first noticed it. A lone humpback thrashing under the pale light of the moon. At first, they thought it was feeding, diving again and again. But something wasn't right. Every time it surfaced, it lingered too long. Every time it dove, it left behind a faint trail that shimmered on the water's skin. One fisherman leaned over his deck light, squinting. His stomach tightened. That wasn't plankton glimmering in the tide. It was oil. Somewhere, the whale had torn itself open against the ropes and crab pots dragging behind it. The weight of them pulled it down like chains. They could hear its tail slap the waves, hard, furious, desperate. The sound carried through the bay like thunder. By dawn, the news had spread along the coast. Locals whispered of a whale stuck offshore, tethered to the bottom like a shipwreck. Some said it was too late already. Others swore they'd seen its massive head rise above the surface, blowing weak sprays as if crying out for help. That morning, James Mosquito got the call. A seasoned diver, he was no stranger to rescues, but whales were a different story. He remembered one all too clearly, a whale shark he'd once watched drift helplessly into a feeding frenzy. He could still hear the chaos of the water, still see the blood spreading wider and wider until the ocean itself seemed to bleed. He hadn't been able to help then. That failure haunted him still. Now, here was another chance, maybe the last one he'd ever get to make it right. The crew met at the dock just after sunrise. The air smelled of salt and diesel. They loaded gear quickly, but not without argument. Someone muttered that they should wait for the Coast Guard. They had bigger boats, stronger equipment. James shook his head. By the time they get here, it'll be too late. Silence fell. Everyone knew he was right. A whale can drown just like a human if held under too long. Hours already had passed. They didn't have hours left to waste, so they boarded one of the fastest boats they had and pushed off. The ride was rough, waves slapping hard against the hull. James gripped the rail and stared out at the horizon, every second stretching longer than the last. 7 miles out, they saw it. The whale's massive body broke the surface in the distance, rolling slow, heavy, as though the sea itself had trapped it. Ropes and floats trailed behind like the tail of some monstrous kite. The strangest thing wasn't the ropes or the traps, it was the way the whale behaved. Most animals, when approached by boats, flee. But this one didn't. It surfaced again, exhaling a plume of mist that sparkled in the morning sun, and then it simply stayed there. Watching, the crew exchanged nervous glances. Was it too weak to resist? Was it surrendering to its fate? Or was it waiting? James narrowed his eyes, the memory of that whale shark clawing at his thoughts. Something about this felt different. The question gnawed at him as the boat slowed to a stop. Had the whale chosen to stay near them? Or was it simply out of strength, a silent beacon for predators lurking in the deep? The boat drifted into silence as the men cut the engines. The only sounds were the slap of waves against the hull and the hiss of the whale's labored breath. James pulled on his gear slowly, eyes never leaving the hulking shape that floated just yards away. Most humpbacks, if startled by a vessel, would dive instantly, thrashing until they were clear. But this one remained exactly where it was, head tilted slightly, a single dark eye above the waterline. It was looking right at him. The crew shifted uneasily. One muttered, "Why isn't it moving?" Another whispered, "It's waiting." James slid into the water, the cold biting into him. Every sense sharpened. The whale loomed ahead like a sinking mountain, motionless except for the faint tremor of its tail. As he swam closer, the first horror revealed itself. Thick, deep grooves marred the whale's flesh where the ropes had bitten in. Some were raw and oozing, blood trailing faintly into the water. The lines weren't just wrapped around it, they were cutting into it, sawing deeper with every movement the animal had made. The more it had fought, the tighter the cords had dug. What had once been a struggle for freedom had become its prison. James's stomach clenched. He'd seen dolphins scarred by netting before, turtles strangled by plastic lines. But nothing like this. The sheer mass of the traps had turned the whale into a living anchor, dragging it down inch by inch. "Look at that," someone whispered from the boat, voice hoarse. "It's tearing it apart." James raised a hand to quiet them. His eyes flicked to the surface of the water around him. That's when he saw it. The rainbow sheen of oil, not just a smear, but a spreading stain that stretched farther than he'd realized. It glimmered in the morning sun, slick and iridescent, a toxic trail leading straight to their position. His pulse quickened. Oil meant blood. Blood meant scent. And in these waters, that scent could draw in predators faster than a flare. "James," one of the crew called nervously, "that's a big slick." "You think?" "I know," James cut in sharply. "Stay alert." He didn't need to say the word. Sharks. The risk hung heavy in every man's throat. But James kept going. The whale hadn't moved, hadn't struck out with its massive flippers or tried to dive. Instead, it floated, holding still, almost eerily so. He could feel its gaze follow him as he circled to the first line. He pulled his knife, testing the tension on the rope. It was wound so tightly he could feel it vibrating under the blade, like a steel cable stretched to its limit. Worse, the traps weren't just tangled haphazardly. Whoever had set them had used thick commercial cord, and the snaring was knotted in layers, crossing and twisting until it resembled a woven cage. James gritted his teeth. This wasn't going to be a single cut and done. This was going to take time they didn't have. He slid the blade under the first strand and sliced. The reaction was instant. The whale shuddered violently, its entire body convulsing with the sudden release of tension. The water roiled. James nearly lost his grip on the line, his body tossed sideways by the force. Shouts erupted from the boat. "Get out of there!" one man yelled. "It's going to crush you!" But the whale didn't strike. It didn't dive or whip its tail. It only resettled, still hovering, eye fixed on James as if waiting for him to continue. James steadied himself, forcing his breathing calm. He raised a hand to the boat. "It's okay. Don't move. Just watch." He went back to work, sawing through another cord. Each time he cut one free, the whale jolted, and each time the crew cried out in alarm. But James noticed something strange. After each spasm, the whale would still itself again, almost as if it understood, almost as if it was helping. Another rope came loose, then another. Each layer revealed how deep the damage went, ropes slicing across fins, belly, tail. Some traps dangled heavily beneath, still locked tight, threatening to drag the animal back under. James's arms burned with the effort. He glanced behind him now and then, eyes sweeping the endless blue. The thought of a dorsal fin breaking the surface haunted every second. Back at the boat, the men whispered fiercely among themselves. Why isn't it fighting him? It could kill him in one swipe. James heard them faintly, but his mind was locked on the eye that watched him. Huge, dark, unblinking. In that gaze there was no malice, no panic, only something he couldn't name. Patience? Trust? It made the hair on the back of his neck rise. Another cord snapped, sending one of the crab pots tumbling into the depths. James felt the whale jolt again, the power of the movement sending a surge through the water. He steadied himself, bracing for the blow that never came. Instead, the giant steadied itself once more, hanging in the current like a suspended shadow. Why? Why would a creature this massive, strong enough to break bones with a flick of its tail, allow fragile humans to crawl over it with knives? Why didn't it fight, flee, or finish them? The question gnawed at him with every cut. Each rope freed was a victory, but also another mystery. The more James worked, the clearer it became. This whale wasn't simply enduring them, it was cooperating. And that realization chilled him more than the thought of sharks ever could. What was this animal waiting for? What would it do once the last rope was finally gone? James worked fast, arms aching, blades sawing through another coil of rope when the water around him suddenly dimmed. A shadow slid beneath his legs, long and slow, blotting out the light. He froze. Seconds later, a dark fin broke the surface 50 yards away, slicing the waves like a blade. The crew erupted in panic. "Shark! James, get out! Get out now!" Chaos rippled across the boat. One man fumbled for a radio. Another shouted, "We're not dying for a whale!" Someone else added, "This is insane. We need to cut our losses before we lose you too." James shook his head hard, never stopping his knife. "If we stop now, it's dead," he barked, voice tight but steady. "You want that on your conscience?" "Because I don't." The whale twitched beneath him, sending another surge of current past his body. James felt the force ripple through the water, a reminder of just how small he was next to this giant. Any second, if the whale panicked, or if the shark came closer, he could be crushed between them. The crew kept yelling. Fear rose like the tide. James could hear it even through the muffled ocean around his ears. His decision came sharp and sudden. "Back to the boat," he shouted, whipping his head toward them. "All of you. Now." "What about you?" someone cried. "I'll finish it." Alone. The order silenced them. They hesitated, torn between abandoning him and following his command. Finally, one by one, they scrambled back aboard, leaving James alone in the water with nothing but the whale and the unknown predator circling below. His knife slipped. For a heartbeat, it dangled between his fingers, threatening to sink into the dark. He clamped it tight, chest heaving. If he lost that blade, it was over. He pressed back to the whale's side, wedging himself against the ropes for balance. Salt water stung his eyes. His lungs ached. He forced himself to focus, to ignore the panic clawing up his throat. "Stay with me," he whispered into his regulator, words meant as much for himself as for the animal. "Just a little longer." The whale gave a sudden, violent jerk. Its massive tail flared, water churning into a whirlpool. James slammed hard against the traps, pain rattling up his ribs. For a split second, he thought the animal had lost control, that it would drag him under in its death throes. But then, stillness again. The eye, always the eye, watching him. James forced his trembling hands back to work. Rope by rope, Cut by cut, he freed more of the giant. The pressure of the traps shifted with every release, each one threatening to collapse inward and pin him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, louder than the waves, louder than the shouts from the distant boat. The last cord was the thickest, wrapped deep across the whale's midsection. James dug his blade under it, muscles screaming as he pulled. It wouldn't budge. He braced both legs against the whale's flank, putting everything he had into the cut. The line frayed, split, and snapped. The release was violent. The whale surged downward with explosive force, a living avalanche vanishing into the blue. The suction nearly ripped James from the surface, dragging him toward the depths. He clawed at the water, fighting to stay up, lungs burning. Then, silence. The sea around him stilled. The massive shape was gone. On the boat, the crew shouted frantically. "Where is it? Where's James? Did it take him?" James treaded water, spinning in every direction, chest hammering. The ocean looked empty, endless, the slick of oil spreading wider with nothing beneath it but darkness. For a terrible moment he thought it was over, that either the whale had drowned, or worse, that he was about to feel jaws close around him. The whale had disappeared, and James had no idea what was coming next. The ocean was still, too still. James turned in the water, pulse hammering. The whale had vanished into the deep, leaving only the widening slick and the distant sound of waves against the boat. "James!" someone screamed from above. "Behind you!" He spun. A shadow rose from the blue-black depths, massive and unstoppable. At first it looked like the dark wall of the seafloor itself, rising to swallow him. The crew clutched the rails, eyes wide. One man shouted, "It's coming for you!" James's body went rigid, every muscle locking. His knife floated loosely in his grip, useless. If the whale meant to strike him, there was nothing he could do. The shape surged closer, closer, until the blunt head of the humpback broke the surface right in front of him. James froze, staring into the enormous eye just inches away. Salt water cascaded down its scarred skin, the wounds from the rope still raw, but no longer bound. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Then gently, impossibly gently, the whale nudged him. Not an accident, not a thrash, a deliberate push, careful and soft. James gasped into his regulator. His chest felt too small to hold the moment. The whale circled him once, slow and deliberate, its massive body brushing the water beside him. Then again. Each loop was measured, as though the animal was tracing a ritual James couldn't understand. The crew stood frozen on deck, some pale, some openly crying. It's thanking him," one whispered, voice breaking. Another shook his head, unable to speak at all. James barely breathed. The giant kept returning, surfacing to blow a spray into the sky before dipping back down, only to circle him again. It lingered for minutes, never straying far, never leaving him alone in the vast water. Every pass carried weight, trust, acknowledgement, something deeper than instinct. This wasn't the thrash of panic or the lash of fear. It was choice. Finally, with one last rise, the whale hovered close again, eye-locking with his. James stared back, trembling, unable to move. He felt smaller than he ever had in his life. Smaller than the sea, smaller than his mistakes, smaller than everything, except this impossible connection. The whale lingered a moment longer, then with a final flick of its tail, it dove into the depths. This time, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a farewell. When James was finally pulled back onto the boat, the crew could only stare at him. Their faces were pale, wet with spray and tears. One man whispered, "I'll never forget what I just saw." Later that day, when marine biologists examined the video footage, they explained the phenomenon. Whales occasionally display what's called milling, circling behavior, often interpreted as recognition or acknowledgement. But documented cases involving direct eye contact, physical touch, and repeated close passes? Those were almost unheard of. This was not chance, the expert said firmly. That whale knew what had happened. It knew who freed it. James sat quietly, still shivering, replaying the eye contact in his mind. The gentle nudge, the deliberate circling. He realized the whale hadn't just survived. It had spoken to him in the only way it could, and it left him frozen in awe, because in that silent exchange, he understood the truth. The whale had been saying thank you. By the time the boat reached the harbor, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. James sat on the deck, still in his soaked wetsuit, staring at the water trailing behind them. His body ached from the effort, his hands burned with rope cuts, but none of that mattered. What he carried with him was something no scar could measure. He had risked his life that morning. Every instinct told him to fear the weight of the traps, the circling shadows, the impossible odds. But what he received in return was beyond anything he had ever imagined. Trust, offered freely by one of the ocean's giants. The crew was quieter than he had ever known them to be. Men who had shouted, argued, and cursed their way through the rescue now sat in stunned silence, eyes distant. Finally, one broke the quiet. "I thought you were crazy," he admitted, voice rough. "I thought you'd get yourself killed. But I'll never look at a whale the same way again." Another nodded, still pale. "I didn't believe animals knew." "Not like that. Not until today." James listened, but he didn't reply. Words seemed small compared to what he had witnessed. The image replayed again and again, the whale's eye fixed on his, the deliberate nudge, the circling like a slow dance in the water. It was burned into him, etched deeper than memory. Back on shore, locals gathered, asking questions, pressing for details. The crew tried to explain, stumbling over their words, their voices breaking. How could anyone describe what it felt like to see a creature so vast, so powerful, choose gentleness, to see gratitude shown without language, without sound, only through action? James said little. He didn't need to. The truth was simple, and it humbled him. Sometimes the deepest gratitude doesn't come in words. It doesn't need to. Sometimes it comes in gestures so profound they leave us breathless, in moments that rewrite how we see the world. He knew that for the rest of his life, no triumph, no achievement, no victory would compare to that morning when a whale looked into his eyes and said, "Thank you," in silence. That night, as the harbor lights flickered against the waves, James closed his eyes. He could still feel it, the weight of the sea, the brush of rough skin against his arm, the endless loops of the whale circling him with care. And he understood something he never had before. Even in the vast, untamed ocean, where humans are small and fragile, bonds of trust can be formed in silence. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, that whale swam free again. And James carried with him the memory of a bond forged not in fear, not in survival, but in gratitude. A moment that left him frozen in awe.